Welcome to your Anatomy and Physiology 1 class at Bristol Community College. This course is the first of a two-part series designed to help you familiarize yourself with the major concepts of human anatomy and physiology. We're going to start with Chapter 1, which is an introduction to A&P. Just a heads up before we get started. To gain a better understanding of what human anatomy looks like, we will occasionally view images of human cadavers, tissues, and organs. We may also view videos of procedures on human bodies. If viewing these resources makes you queasy or extremely uncomfortable, you may want to consider a different course or a different career path. The major objectives for Chapter 1 include describing the characteristics of life and the processes carried out by living organisms, describing the structural levels of organization in the human body, and defining anatomy and physiology, and being able to describe different types. These objectives, plus others belonging to Chapter 1, are located in the Chapter 1 folder in your Blackboard course space. Anatomy is the study of structure, and we can approach it in different ways. We can look at what's called the gross or macroscopic anatomy of structures in the human body. Gross or macroscopic anatomy deals with those structures that we can see with our naked eye. For example, we might look at the gross anatomy of the heart. In this type of study, we might look at the blood vessels, the nerves, the muscles, and valves that we can view with our eyes. There are other types of macroscopic anatomy that are also useful to observe. In regional anatomy, all of the structures, that is the muscle, the bones, the blood vessels, nerves, etc., in a particular region of the body are studied. So we might look at all of the structures of the abdomen or the leg at the same time. In systemic anatomy, body structures are studied system by system. So, for example, when studying the cardiovascular system, you would examine the heart and all of the blood vessels of the entire body. Another division of gross anatomy is the surface anatomy. Here you study the internal structures as they relate to the overlying surface of the skin. So you can use surface anatomy to identify bulging muscles beneath a bodybuilder's skin, for example. Or a clinician might use surface anatomy to locate appropriate blood vessels, to feel pulses, or to draw blood. Microscopic anatomy deals with structures that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. For such studies, thin slices of body tissues are stained and mounted onto glass slides to be looked at with a microscope. Subdivisions of microscopic anatomy include cytology, which considers the cells of the body, and histology, which considers the tissues of the body. So we'll be doing some histology in Chapter 4, where we'll be looking at images that look a little bit like this one, and we'll be able to identify the parts of those images, and we'll be able to identify the tissues in the image. Another type of anatomy is developmental anatomy. This type of anatomy traces structural changes that occur throughout life. Okay. Embryology is a subdivision of developmental anatomy. Here it's concerned with the developmental changes that occur before birth. So to study human anatomy, there's a variety of tools that we need. One essential tool is going to be mastery of anatomical terminology. As we go through the different chapters in this course, you will begin to master these various terms. The remaining tools I'm kind of reminded of when I think back to an event earlier this year where I injured my knee. I went to a doctor's office after that injury occurred, and the first tool that the doctor used was observation. He looked at my knee to observe any swelling, redness, or bruising that he could see with his eyes. Next, he tried to manipulate my knee joint. He placed his hands around my knee and tried to bend it in different directions, looking for sore spots or places where the knee didn't function the way it was supposed to. Palpation. He pressed different parts of my knee joint to try to feel were the bones aligned properly, were there any bulges present that shouldn't be there, um, how did the knee feel? And then auscultation. As part of the exam, he listened to my heart and to my lungs to make sure that they were also functioning properly. Physiology is the study of function in the human body, and oftentimes we'll subdivide the human body in order to look at physiology. For example, we might look at cardiovascular physiology. In cardiovascular physiology, we might look at the force and the rate at which a heart pumps blood. We might look at the force that that blood puts on blood vessels, aka blood pressure. We might look at how open the blood vessels are, that's dilation, or closed, which is constriction. All of that would be physiology. Oftentimes, physiology also focuses on molecular and cellular levels. So later in the semester, we'll look at the chemical reactions, like these, that happen inside of muscle cells to produce a contraction. We'll look at how proteins interact together with ions and molecules like ATP in order for us to move food throughout our body, to pump blood throughout our body, or to move our limbs. So studying physiology requires the ability to focus on details at many levels of organization, from systemic to cellular and molecular. You need to have a basic understanding of physical principles like electrical current, pressure, and movement. And then an understanding of basic chemical principles is important as well. In this course, I will help remind you of the principles that are important for understanding some of the topics that we'll be dealing with. Anatomy and physiology are inseparable. They're like two sides of the same coin. The function of organs and tissues in the body always are reflected by their structure. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First, let's look at the skull. One of the main functions of the skull is to protect the brain and sense organs of the body. Now, the brain is kind of soft and spongy like in consistency. And because it controls the main functions of the body, it's important that we protect this particular organ. So the skull is made out of bone, and bone is about 65% mineral. Minerals like calcium and phosphorus. And it's this mineral content that makes the bone hard. In the skull, we're going to find a rather large cavity, which I'm going to attempt to highlight in green here. Okay, so there's a rather large cavity. And the brain fits within this cavity. So here you can see another dissection of a cadaver, and here you can actually see the brain. Again, I'm going to highlight it in green, sitting inside the skull. I've tried to highlight the skull in red so you can get a feel for where it is in this image. So it forms almost like a little case around the brain to protect it. Another example would be in your muscles. So what you're looking at here is a dissected cadaver. They've stripped the skin, underlying fat, and fascia away so that we can see the muscles. Here's an example of one of the muscles of the upper arm. This is the biceps brachii, and it's made up of cells called myocytes or muscle cells. These cells are long and cylindrical, and they have a unique characteristic in that they can shorten. So this muscle, which is composed of these myocytes that can shorten, is attached here at your shoulder, and then it extends down to attach to bones that are in your forearm. When these cells contract and shorten, it allows us to move our forearm closer to our upper arm or closer to the body. So the form or structure of these cells in the muscle is related to function, which is moving bone. Let's see what you've retained. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Give them a little bit of thought, pause the video, and then join me again for the answer. Your first question is, blank is the study of the body's structure. Is that histology, anatomy, embryology, or physiology? Did you say anatomy? Anatomy would be the right answer. Good job. Here's your second question. Blank is the study of the body's function. Is that histology, anatomy, embryology, or physiology? I hope you said physiology. If you did, that's correct. Human anatomy can be studied at different levels of structural organization. The most simple and basic level of organization is the chemical level. Here, combinations of atoms are bonded together to form molecules like lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. These molecules will then combine to form organelles. The next level of organization is the cellular level. Cells are the simplest unit of life. That is, they're the simplest unit that can carry out all of those life characteristics that you talked about in Bio 111. Things like respiration and metabolism, growth, evolution, development, response to stimuli, etc. Cells are produced by molecules and organelles which come together in an organized way, and the structure of a cell is going to reflect its function. Tissues are groups of cells, okay, groups of similar cells that have common functions. And there are four main types of tissues. They are your epithelial tissues, which we're going to find covering surfaces and lining cavities. We'll also find that glands within the human body are composed of this tissue type. Connective tissue. These tissues are going to support, bind, and protect body organs. Muscle tissue, which shortens or contracts to provide movement. And then your fourth tissue type is called nervous tissue. Its job is to send messages using electrical signals. You'll want to know the structures and functions and characteristics of these tissues, but we'll go over them in more detail in Chapter 4. Your next level of organization is going to be the organ. Organs are discrete structures composed of two or more tissues that are capable of complex functions. Some examples of organs in the human body would be the stomach, the skin, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, the brain. Groups of organs may work together towards a common function. In this case, they'll make up an organ system. And some functions that organ systems are responsible for include moving blood, breaking down food, and eliminating waste. So let's look at moving blood first. Your cardiovascular system is composed of your heart and all of your blood vessels. These two groups of organs work together to move blood throughout your body. Organs of the digestive system, like the stomach, the liver, the intestines, the esophagus, the salivary glands, etc., break down food into nutrients, which can be absorbed and then distributed throughout the body. Your final level of organization is the organismal level. This is the sum of all the organ systems functioning together, working together to keep a human being alive. The last thing we want to talk about in this particular video are necessary life functions. These are going to be processes that all human beings must carry out in order to live successfully. These functions include maintaining boundaries, movement, responsiveness, digestion, metabolism, excretion, reproduction, and growth. So, one essential function for all human beings is to separate the internal environments of our body and cells from the external environment that surrounds us. We do this through plasma membranes around our cells and through our skin. A lot of the chemical reactions that keep us alive depend upon specific concentrations of molecules and minerals. Imagine what would happen if every time you went outside and it was raining, all of those chemicals and minerals would be diluted. Those chemical reactions that you need to live would essentially cease to happen and you'd die. So plasma membranes and skin help keep that from happening. A second essential function is movement. This happens through the contraction of muscles within our body. So contraction of skeletal muscle allows us to move body parts so that we can run away from danger or run towards food. Contraction of smooth and cardiac muscles allows us to move nutrients and substances like blood throughout our body to our various tissues, which helps us stay alive. And movement of substances within or between cells is also important and essential for life. So in this part of chapter 1, we've really focused on a couple of different things. First, we defined what anatomy and physiology are. We talked about how anatomy is related to structure and physiology is related to function. We said that these two things are interrelated and that there are different tools that we need to study them. For example, for anatomy, you might use the tools of observation, manipulation, palpation, and auscultation. For physiology, you might use tools of understanding basic physical processes like electrical currents and the movement of substances. You might have to be able to focus on different levels of activity at one time. The other thing that we talked about is how the human body can be divided up into different levels of organization. And from molecule to organ system, structure is always going to be related to function. We also learned that the human body can be studied at multiple levels of organization, the most simple being the chemical level, the most complex being the organismal level. I hope you find this video helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in class.